decollectivization of agriculture was the first major economic reform in China. In today's talk, I want to explain how collective agriculture was organized before the introduction of this new system of household farming. And then I want to talk about the reasons and kind of experiences that led to the adoption of the household responsibility system. And finally, I want to talk about the impact that the return to household farming had on the marketing and output of China's agricultural sector and the impact on China's overall economic reforms. Now, in China, collective agriculture featured production where no private land existed and all of the land was collectively owned. Local production teams of workers were expected to be self-sufficient, meaning produce enough grain to feed themselves and to follow the production plans that were sent down to them by upper levels of government. All of the output produced by each production team was sold to the government at a fixed price, and some of the grain was returned to individual members of the collective based on a work point system, which rewarded individual workers a certain number of points for every day that they spent out working in the field. Now, one of the problems of collective agriculture is that it can really reduce the incentives of individual workers to exert effort. To see why that is the case, consider the problem of the decision of how much effort to exert in agriculture. We can think of a marginal benefit curve from private agricultural where the return to increasing effort is always positive, but it declines as more effort is exerted. Similarly, we can think of a marginal cost curve that increases as more effort is exerted. And the intersection of these two will determine the amount of effort that is exerted in private agriculture. Now, in collective agriculture, the effort incentives are reduced because the marginal benefit is much smaller because you have to share the output with all of the members of the collective. Let's assume there are n members of the collective. This reduces the marginal benefit curve and leads to an equilibrium level of effort which is much lower than in private agriculture. But how large was that n, the number of people in the collective unit? Well, under the collective system, the number of families involved in one production team typically was 33, the number of people 145. During the Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s, China increased the scale of collective production to the commune level, and that was a case where the number of families were over 3,000, the number of people were over 14,000. So you can see that effort incentives would have been even much lower under that system. In China, we can trace the origins of the household responsibility system to one village in Anhui province, Shaogang village. This is a village in which 67 out of 120 villagers had died of starvation during the Great Leap Forward. This is a village where, because they believed so strongly that they would do much better if they could farm the land individually, that they made a secret illegal agreement in December of 1978, just after Deng had announced that China was going to move in the direction of reform. And they decided they would divide the land into family plots, and that if any of them were caught or imprisoned for these actions, that the other families would agree to take care of their children until they reached adulthood. The result was spectacular. The output of the land increased by more than 5 times. Soon, other production teams in Anhui heard about this model and started to adopt it as well. And you can see here there are some results found by researchers at the time that show that for production teams, the average grain production increased by over 30% compared to very little change for the counties as a whole, whole where these production teams were located. And interestingly, this data, which was collected by young researchers from Beijing, who then went back and informed some of the top leaders who were trying to be proponents of economic reform, it helped those top leaders convince the other top leaders that although this was not quite in the full spirit of communist organization, the gains were so dramatic that the government should allow this reform to continue. And it did. And the result was that by 1983, the use of household responsibility system agriculture had expanded to the entire country. All of the production teams in the country shifted to this model. Now, some scholars have done some research on how much this reform increased agricultural production in China. And you can see the estimates range from 20% on the low end to 60% on the high end. So quite dramatic increases. If we think about other things that the government did during this early reform period to help encourage farmers to exert more effort in agriculture, the main area that we should look at is the marketing reforms. Now remember, initially, much of the agricultural output was sold to the government at a planned price. And the government, the first thing they did was raise those prices substantially to put more income into the pockets of farmers and give them more of an incentive to exert effort. Now, initially, the households had to continue selling part of their grain at a low price, kind of a tax on farmers to the government. But this kind of tax was eventually eliminated as the price paid to farmers increased to the market price. At the same time, markets were gradually allowed to develop, and farmers could sell extra grain at the free market price, which typically was higher than the planned prices. Finally, by 1993, the government eliminated all subsidies from agriculture, that all of the procurement of grain and the sales of grain, whether by the government or by other private traders, was all done at market prices. So if we look back at the importance of the household responsibility, it's useful to point out several aspects of this reform. The first is that it's a very good example of bottom-up institutional change. The impetus came from farmers, not from a government blueprint. However, the top leaders of China, once they saw the success, did decide to support the reform and allow it to expand. It was also a very successful reform, and since it was the first major reform, set a very good precedent and a model for further economic reforms in other areas of the economy, especially industry. Third, the increase in output and incomes had a number of very beneficial spillover effects for industrial development in China. As farmer incomes rose, people wanted to spend some of that money on consumer goods and more agricultural inputs, and this, of course, creates a market for industrial production. In addition, the higher incomes also led to greater savings, which, if put into a bank, could be then financed, be used to finance investments in industry. And finally, by raising productivity, it released some of the labor from households concerned about self-sufficiency to migrate and become workers in Chinese factories elsewhere. The marketing reforms were also important, not only by raising the prices and making the prices reflect the true valuation of consumers and so increasing efficiency, but also because China avoided a system in which the government heavily intervened in subsidizing either grain production or grain sales, which has been very costly to many governments in other developing countries.